Ever had someone toss you aside like trash, only to choke on your glow-up years later? Picture this. You're standing in front of 500 of the most powerful people in America, delivering a speech about legacy and family, values, when the woman you abandoned walks through those marble doors, holding two little boys who look exactly like you did at their age. The silence hits like a freight train. Camera phones start flashing, and suddenly, your carefully crafted empire feels like it's built on quicksand. Drayson Vale adjusted his platinum cufflinks one last time before stepping up to the crystal podium at the Rosemont Foundation Gala. The ballroom sparkled with Manhattan's elite, their diamonds catching the chandelier light like scattered stars. Wall Street titans, tech moguls, and old money aristocrats filled every table, their conversations, creating a sophisticated hum that spoke of billion-dollar deals and generational wealth. Ladies and gentlemen, Drayson's voice carried across the room with practiced authority. Tonight we celebrate not just philanthropy, but the sacred duty of legacy. His steel-gray eyes swept across the audience as he gripped the podium. At 32, he commanded respect without effort. His custom Armani suit fit like liquid obsidian, and his presence filled the space like he owned every inch of it. The massive screens flanking the stage displayed images of children in underfunded schools, their faces bright with hope despite their circumstances. Drayson's voice grew stronger as he continued. Every dollar we raise tonight doesn't just change a life. It builds the foundation for generations yet to come. Because true wealth isn't measured in what we accumulate, but in what we leave behind. Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family. Enjoy the story. The applause began to build when something shifted in the room's energy. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned toward the entrance like synchronized swimmers following an invisible conductor. The massive oak doors had opened, and every eye in the ballroom was now fixed on the figure walking through them. She moved like liquid confidence poured into an emerald silk gown that hugged her curves with mathematical precision. Her natural hair was styled in an elegant twist that showcased her graceful neck, and her brown skin seemed to glow under the ballroom's golden lighting. She wasn't just beautiful. She radiated the kind of magnetic presence that made gravity itself seem optional. But it wasn't just her that had stopped the room cold. Two little boys flanked her sides, their small hands clasped in hers. They wore matching navy suits that made them look like miniature princes, their curly hair perfectly styled, their dark eyes wide as they took in the grandeur around them. They couldn't have been more than 5 years old, but they carried themselves with a quiet dignity that seemed far beyond their years. Drayson's words died in his throat. The teleprompter kept scrolling, but he couldn't read a single line. His hands gripped the podium so hard his knuckles went white, and his carefully rehearsed speech evaporated like morning mist. Because those boys didn't just look familiar. They looked like him. Not similar. Not reminiscent. Identical. From their sharp jawlines to the way they tilted their heads when curious, from their thick eyebrows to the small dimple that appeared when they smiled. It was like looking at home movies of himself from 27 years ago, except these children existed. In real time, standing in his ballroom, holding the hand of the woman he'd tried so hard to forget. Zarella Baptiste, the nutritionist who'd turned his world upside down 5 years ago with her quick wit and stubborn principles. The woman who'd challenged every assumption he'd made about relationships and power. The woman he'd dismissed like she meant nothing when she'd needed him most. Now she stood in his sanctuary, looking like she'd stepped off the cover of Essence magazine, radiating success and confidence in equal measure. Her eyes found his across the crowded ballroom, and for a moment, time suspended itself. No words were exchanged, but her message was crystal clear. Surprise. The murmurs started low, like distant thunder, then grew into a rumbling wave of recognition and speculation. Phone cameras began appearing, their flashes creating a constellation of light across the ballroom. The city's social media was about to explode, and Drayson knew it. One of the boys, the one on her left, looked directly at Drayson with eyes that mirrored his own. The child's gaze was curious but unafraid, studying the man on the stage with the kind of intensity that made grown men uncomfortable. Then, in a moment that would haunt Drayson for weeks to come, the little boy raised his free hand and waved. Just waved, like he was greeting an old friend. Drayson's legs went weak. His vision blurred at the edges, and the carefully controlled world he'd built around himself started cracking like ice on a warming lake. 500 pairs of eyes watched him struggle to maintain composure while his past walked boldly into his present, wearing emerald silk and holding his future by the hand. The boy who'd waved whispered something to his mother, never taking his eyes off Drayson. Zarella bent down to listen, her expression unreadable, then straightened and looked directly at the stage. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She just looked at him with the kind of calm that preceded earthquakes. Drayson tried to continue his speech, but the words came out fractured and hollow. Legacy is what we... His voice cracked like a teenager's, and he cleared his throat, desperately trying to regain control. What we build for those who come after us. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The second boy, slightly smaller but equally striking, tugged on Zarella's dress and pointed toward the stage. She nodded and began walking forward, her sons matching her measured pace. Every step they took seemed to echo through the ballroom despite the thick carpet beneath their feet. Drayson watched them approach the front tables, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird. Investors and board members who'd known him for years were now staring at him with questions written across their faces. The resemblance was too strong to ignore, too obvious to dismiss. As Zarella and the boys settled into seats at a front table that hadn't been reserved for them, Drayson realized that his carefully orchestrated evening had just become something else entirely. The woman he'd tried to erase from his memory had just walked back into his life, and she'd brought proof of everything he'd tried to forget. The boy who'd waved was still watching him, his small head tilted slightly. To the side in a gesture Drayson recognized from his own childhood photos. When their eyes met again, the child mouthed a single word that only Drayson could see. "Daddy." The crystal champagne flute in Drayson's hand shattered against the marble floor, and 500 guests watched the most powerful man in the room stumble backward from his own podium, his face as white as the broken glass at his feet. What happens when the past you buried decides to introduce itself to your future? Share this story if you believe some secrets are too big to stay hidden, and let us know in the comments. Have you ever had your past walk through the door when you least expected it? 6 years earlier, Drayson Vale stood in the penthouse of the Meridian Tower, surrounded by Manhattan's biotech elite. The party buzzed with venture capitalists, pharmaceutical executives, and startup founders, all celebrating another successful investment round. Crystal glasses clinked, designer heels clicked against marble floors, and deals worth millions were discussed between appetizers and aged whiskey. Drayson nursed his green smoothie, feeling slightly ridiculous among the champagne crowd. His personal trainer had put him on a strict nutrition plan, and he wasn't about to break it for social expectations. Besides, at 27, he was already managing a portfolio worth more than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. He could afford to be different. "Interesting choice," a voice said behind him, warm and slightly amused. "Most people at these events are trying to impress each other with how much expensive alcohol they can handle. You're over here sipping what looks like liquefied vegetables." Drayson turned and found himself looking at a woman who seemed completely out of place and absolutely perfect for it at the same time. She wasn't wearing designer anything. Her black dress was simple, elegant, and probably cost less than his watch. Her natural hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her brown skin glowed like she spent time in actual sunlight instead of boardrooms. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. They were intelligent, curious, and completely unimpressed by the wealth surrounding them. She looked at him like he was just a person, not a portfolio or a power play. When was the last time someone had done that? "It's a superfood blend," he said, raising his glass slightly. "Kale, spinach, ginger, and a few other things I can't pronounce. My trainer swears it's the secret to maintaining energy during 18-hour workdays." She nodded thoughtfully, like she was actually processing the information instead of just waiting for her turn to talk. "Your trainer knows what they're talking about, though they probably didn't mention that you're missing some key nutrients. That could boost your absorption rate by about 40%. Drayson blinked. Nobody at these parties talked about absorption rates. "You're in nutrition?" "Zarella Baptiste," she said, extending her hand. "And yes, I specialize in nutritional biochemistry, specifically how what we eat affects cognitive function and emotional regulation. I'm here because one of my clients is launching a supplement company and they wanted someone who actually understands the science instead of just the marketing." Her handshake was firm, confident, and lasted exactly the right amount of time. No lingering, no games, no agenda beyond basic politeness. Drayson found it refreshingly honest. "Drayson Vale. I invest in companies that promise to change the world, though most of them just want to get rich trying." He gestured around the room with his green smoothie. What's your professional opinion on this crowd? Zarella glanced around the party, taking in the excessive displays of wealth and status. Honestly, half these people are probably malnourished despite having access to the best food money can buy. Stress, poor sleep, and too much alcohol create nutritional deficiencies that no amount of money can fix. They're running their bodies like sports cars on regular unleaded. And the other half? Smart enough to hire people like me to fix what their lifestyles are breaking. Her smile was knowing but not judgmental. Which category do you fall into? The question caught him off guard. Most people either kissed up to him or tried to sell him something within the first 5 minutes. Zarella seemed genuinely interested in his answer, like she was solving a puzzle instead of working an angle. I'm not sure yet, he admitted. I work constantly, sleep when I remember to, and apparently drink vegetables at cocktail parties. What's your diagnosis, doctor? I'm not a doctor, just someone who pays attention to patterns. She studied him for a moment, her gaze moving from his face to his posture to the way he held his glass. You're disciplined enough to stick to a nutrition plan in a social setting, which suggests good impulse control. But you're here alone, which either means you're antisocial or you don't trust easily. And you're drinking that smoothie like medicine instead of enjoying it, which tells me someone else designed your life and you're just executing it. Drayson stared at her. In 30 seconds, she'd read him more accurately than people who'd known him for years. That's either very impressive or very terrifying. Why can't it be both? Her laugh was genuine, unguarded, and completely magnetic. The human body tells stories if you know how to listen. Most people just aren't paying attention. For the next 2 hours, they talked about everything except business. She told him about growing up in New Orleans, where her grandmother taught her that food was medicine long before it became trendy. He found himself sharing stories about his childhood in Connecticut, where emotional expression was as rare as genuine laughter. She challenged everything he said, not aggressively, but with the kind of intellectual curiosity that made him think harder about his own opinions. When he mentioned his 16-hour workdays, she asked why he needed external validation so badly. When he talked about his investment philosophy, she questioned whether he was building something meaningful or just accumulating zeros. Nobody had ever asked him questions like that. Nobody had ever made him feel like his answers mattered more than his net worth. I should probably get going, Zarella said as the party began to wind down. Early client session tomorrow, and I need my 8 hours if I'm going to be worth anything. 8 hours? Drayson couldn't hide his surprise. I usually get by on 4 or 5. That's not getting by. That's slowly dying. She pulled a card from her purse and handed it to him. If you ever want to learn how to actually take care of yourself instead of just managing your decline, call me. Fair warning though, I don't work with people who aren't serious about change. She turned to leave, then paused and looked back. And Drayson? That smoothie would taste better with a handful of frozen pineapple and a squeeze of lime. Life's too short to drink medicine that tastes like punishment. Drayson watched her walk away, disappearing into the Manhattan night like she'd never been there at all. He looked down at her business card, simple white cardstock with elegant black lettering. Zarella Baptiste, nutritional consultant. Your body is the only home you'll ever have. Let's make it a good one. He called her the next morning. Their first session was supposed to be about meal planning and supplement timing. Instead, they spent 3 hours talking about stress, sleep, and why he felt like he was constantly running towards something he couldn't name. She didn't just redesign his nutrition plan, she made him question everything about how he was living his life. The second session turned into dinner. The third became a weekend in the Hamptons. By the fourth, they were sharing hotel rooms in Aspen and debating philosophy between ski runs. For 6 months, Drayson experienced something he'd never had before, a relationship, with someone who saw past his portfolio to the person underneath. Zarella challenged him, supported him, and made him laugh in ways he'd forgotten were possible. She never asked for anything except his honesty, and she gave hers in return without reservation. They never defined what they were. Labels felt too small for what was happening between them. But late at night, when she fell asleep in his arms after making him dinner in his sterile penthouse kitchen, Drayson allowed himself to imagine what forever might look like with someone who made him want to be better than he was. That illusion lasted exactly one conversation. The morning Zarella called to tell him she was pregnant, sitting alone in her small Harlem apartment while he was. In his corner office 70 floors above the city, Drayson felt something inside himself shut down completely. Because forever was a luxury he'd never learned how to afford, and some dreams were too dangerous to survive contact with reality. Zarella stared at her phone for 10 minutes before making the call. She'd taken 3 pregnancy tests, scheduled a doctor's appointment, and spent 2 sleepless nights, trying to figure out how to share news that felt like pure magic and pure terror at the same time. Her small Harlem apartment felt both too cramped and too empty as she paced between her kitchen and living room, rehearsing words that never sounded right. She and Drayson had never talked about children. They'd never talked about the future at all, really. Their relationship existed in a beautiful bubble of present moments, expensive dinners, and conversations that lasted until sunrise. But this felt different. This felt like the universe giving them a reason to finally define what they meant to each other. When Drayson picked up on the second ring, his voice carried the warm familiarity that had become her favorite sound in the world. "Hey, beautiful. How's your morning?" "I need to see you," Zarella said, her voice steadier than she felt. "There's something important I need to tell you. Can't it wait until tonight? I've got back-to-back meetings until 6, and the Soul investors are flying in for dinner." His tone was distracted, professional. She could hear keyboards clicking and phones ringing in the background. "Drayson, this can't wait." Something in her voice must have cut through the office noise because the background sounds suddenly became muffled. "Are you okay? You sound different." "I'm pregnant." Silence. Not the comfortable quiet they sometimes shared during late-night conversations, but the kind of empty space that felt like falling. Zarella could hear her own heartbeat in her ears as she waited for his response. "Are you sure?" His voice had changed completely. The warmth was gone, replaced by something clinical and distant. "I took 3 tests, saw a doctor yesterday. I'm about 8 weeks along." She tried to keep the hurt out of her voice, but it crept in anyway. This wasn't how she'd imagined this conversation going. Another pause, longer this time. When Drayson spoke again, he sounded like he was reading from a script. "Zarella, we need to be realistic about this situation. We agreed from the beginning that what we have is casual. No strings, no expectations." Casual? The word hit her like a slap. "Drayson, you've been spending 4 nights a week at my place for 6 months. You know my grandmother's recipes and my middle name. You cried watching me teach kids nutrition at the community center. That doesn't feel casual to me. I think you're reading more into this than what's actually there." His voice had gone completely flat, like he was speaking to a stranger. "We're attracted to each other, we enjoy each other's company, but that doesn't mean we're building towards something permanent." Zarella sat down heavily on her couch, feeling like all the air had been sucked out of the room. The man talking to her sounded nothing like the person who'd held her hand during her grandmother's funeral just 2 months ago. Nothing like the man who'd whispered that she made him believe in magic during their weekend in Martha's Vineyard. "So, what are you saying exactly?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm saying that this complicates things in ways I'm not prepared to handle. I have responsibilities, commitments, a public image to maintain. I can't just drop everything because of an accident." "An accident?" Zarella repeated the words slowly, feeling their weight settle in her chest like stones. "Is that what you think this is? What else would you call it? We were careful most of the time, but these things happen. Look, I'll cover whatever you need to handle this situation. Doctor visits, procedures, whatever makes sense. My assistant can arrange everything discreetly." The casual way he said procedures made Zarella's stomach turn. She pressed her free hand against her still flat belly, protecting something he clearly saw as disposable. "Handle the situation," she repeated. "You want me to get rid of our baby so it doesn't interfere with your responsibilities. I'm trying to be practical here, Zarella. Think about what you're asking. I'm not ready for children, and frankly, neither are you. You're 26, you barely make enough to cover your rent, and you're talking about bringing a child into the world with someone you've known for 6 months. That's not love, that's fantasy." Each word felt like a blade, precisely placed to cut the deepest. The worst part was that some of it was true. She was young, her income was unpredictable, and their relationship existed mostly in expensive restaurants and his luxury apartment. But none of that mattered when she thought about the tiny life growing inside her. "You're right," she said quietly. "I barely know you at all. Zarella, I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm trying to protect both of us from making a mistake that will impact the rest of our lives. The only mistake I made was thinking you were someone you're not." Her voice was steady now, cold as winter steel. "But thank you for showing me who you really are before I wasted any more time believing in fairy tales. This doesn't have to end badly between us. We can handle this like adults and move forward." "Move forward?" Zarella almost laughed, but the sound caught in her throat. "Drayson, there is no us to move forward with. There never was. You just made that crystal clear. I think you're being emotional right now. Maybe we should talk about this when you've had time to process everything rationally." That's when something inside Zarella snapped completely. The part of her that had been raised by a grandmother who took no nonsense from anyone, who'd worked 3 jobs to put herself through college, who'd built a business from nothing but determination and skill. "Let me save you the trouble of another conversation," she said, her voice sharp as broken glass. "I don't want your money, your procedures, or your rational solutions. I don't want anything from you at all. This baby and I will be just fine without you." "Zarella, wait. Let's not make any hasty decisions here. The only hasty decision I made was trusting you with something precious. I won't make that mistake again." She hung up before he could respond. For the next 2 hours, Zarella sat on her couch and didn't cry. She wouldn't give him that power. Instead, she made lists, things she needed to do, changes she needed to make, people she needed to call. Her landlord, her clients, her doctor. Her future was no longer tied to a man who saw love as a liability and children as accidents. Around noon, her phone rang. Drayson's name flashed on the screen, but she let it go to voicemail. It rang 4 more times over the next hour. She never answered. The voicemails were variations on the same theme. He'd been too harsh. They needed to discuss options. He wanted to help her make the right decision. Not once did he say he was sorry. Not once did he say he'd been wrong. And not once did he sound like the man she'd fallen in love with. By evening, she'd made her decision. She was keeping the baby, with or without him. She was also keeping her dignity, which meant no more phone calls, no more explanations, and no more hoping he'd transform into someone capable of love. 3 days later, she found an envelope slipped under her apartment door. Inside was a check for $50,000 and a business card for a legal firm that specialized in discreet family planning solutions. No note, no explanation, just money and a way to make the problem disappear. Zarella tore up the check and threw the business card in the trash. But she kept the envelope because it reminded her of exactly how much she was worth to the father of her child, the cost of his convenience. 2 weeks after that, she went for her first ultrasound alone. The technician moved the wand across her belly, and suddenly the room filled with a sound like underwater heartbeats. Fast, strong, and absolutely determined to exist. "Is that?" Zarella started to ask. "2 heartbeats," the technician said with a smile. "Congratulations, you're having twins." Zarella stared at the grainy black and white screen showing 2 tiny figures curled together like they were protecting each other. Her hand moved to her belly, and for the first time since that phone call, she smiled. "Hear that?" She whispered to the babies growing inside her. "You're not accidents, you're miracles. And we're going to prove it." Outside in the hallway, she could hear other couples celebrating their news together. But Zarella didn't feel alone anymore. She had everything she needed to build a family, love, determination, and 2 little fighters, who were already teaching her that the best things in life are worth protecting at any cost. 3 months after that devastating phone call, Zarella drove through the Spanish moss-draped streets of Savannah, Georgia, with everything she owned packed into the back of her car. The humid air carried the scent of jasmine and possibility as she navigated the cobblestone roads looking for the small storefront she'd rented sight unseen based on nothing but photos and a leap of faith. Her savings account had enough for 6 months of rent and basic living expenses if she was careful. She'd closed her nutrition practice in New York, said goodbye to clients who'd become friends, and left behind a life that had never felt fully hers anyway. Now, at 25 weeks pregnant, she was starting over in a city where nobody knew her story or judged her choices. The space she'd rented was smaller than her old apartment, but it had large windows, facing the street, and enough room for a few tables and a small kitchen. Her vision was simple, a wellness cafe that served nutritious food to working families who couldn't afford expensive, healthy options. She'd offer sliding-scale nutrition consultations, teach cooking classes for parents, and create the kind of community space she'd needed but never found in Manhattan. "Body Alchemy Cafe," she said aloud, testing how the name sounded in the quiet space. It felt right. Transformation through nourishment, magic through science, healing through food. Everything Drayson had dismissed as insignificant, she was about to prove essential. The first month was harder than she'd expected. Her feet swelled from standing too long, her back ached from lifting equipment, and some nights she fell asleep at the small table she'd set up as her temporary desk, surrounded by business permits and supplier contracts. But every morning, She placed her hands on her growing belly and reminded her sons that they were building something together. Because she'd decided they were boys. Not because of any medical confirmation yet, but because of the way they moved inside. Her during the hardest moments, like they were telling her to keep fighting. She'd started talking to them while she painted the cafe walls sunshine yellow and hung local artwork from struggling artists. "Your daddy thinks you're mistakes," she told them one evening as she assembled her first batch of tables. "But I know better. You're going to change the world, one meal at a time." The cafe opened on a Tuesday morning in October with no fanfare and 3 customers. By the end of the first week, word had spread through the neighborhood about the pregnant woman who made healthy food affordable and never turned anyone away, even when they couldn't pay full price. Zarella developed a barter system that kept her afloat and fed people who needed it most. She traded nutrition consultations for babysitting services, exchanged cooking lessons for help with bookkeeping, and accepted homemade goods in lieu of cash when necessary. The cafe became more than a business. It became a lifeline for young mothers, elderly neighbors, on fixed incomes, and anyone trying to make healthy choices on an unhealthy budget. At 32 weeks, Zarella woke up in the middle of the night with cramping. That felt like someone was squeezing her entire abdomen in a vice. She called an ambulance herself, grabbed the hospital bag she'd packed weeks earlier, and arrived at the emergency room alone, but absolutely determined not to panic. The doctors confirmed her worst fear: early labor. Too early. The twins were trying to enter the world 8 weeks before they were ready, and nothing the medical team tried could convince them to wait. Taeyeon arrived first, barely 4 pounds and struggling to breathe on his own. The NICU team whisked him away before Zarella could hold him, leaving her with only a glimpse of tiny fingers and the memory of a cry so small it sounded like a whisper. Naller followed 6 minutes later, even smaller than his brother and completely silent. The delivery room that had been full of urgent voices suddenly became terrifyingly quiet as the medical team worked to get him breathing. When his first cry finally came, weak but determined, Zarella sobbed with relief she hadn't realized she was holding. "They're fighters," the NICU doctor told her later, as they stood outside the glass walls where her sons lay connected to machines that beeped and hummed with electronic life support. Premature twins often are. They've been looking out for each other since conception, and they're not about to stop now. Taeyeon spent 6 weeks learning to breathe without assistance. His lungs were underdeveloped, and every day brought new challenges that tested both his strength and Zarella's resolve. She spent 12 hours a day beside his incubator, reading nutrition textbooks aloud, and playing soft music through speakers the nurses let her connect to his bedside. Naller faced different challenges. His hearing had been affected by the early birth, and the audiologist explained that he would likely need hearing aids for the rest of his life. But when Zarella placed her hand on his chest and hummed lullabies her grandmother had sung to her, his heart rate stabilized in ways that impressed the entire medical team. "Some people are natural healers," one of the nurses told her. "Your boys are lucky to have you." Those weeks in the NICU taught Zarella things about love she'd never understood before. Love wasn't the butterflies and passion she'd felt with Drayson. It was sitting beside an incubator for 14 hours straight, pumping breast milk every 3 hours around the clock, and celebrating the victory of a baby gaining 2 ounces in a week. Real love was quiet determination, consistent presence, and the absolute refusal to give up when everything seemed impossible. The medical bills were overwhelming, even with insurance. Zarella's cafe had been closed for 2 months, and her savings were gone. But the community she'd started building rallied in ways that restored her faith in human goodness. Customers organized fundraisers, local restaurants donated meals, and complete strangers left cash in a jar by the hospital's family waiting area. When the twins finally came home, they transformed the small apartment above the cafe into something that had never existed in Zarella's life before, a real home. Taeyeon slept best when he could hear the bustle of the cafe below, and Naller's face lit up when customers waved at him through the apartment windows. Zarella reopened Body Alchemy Cafe with a new mission. It wasn't just about healthy food anymore. It was about proving that families come in all shapes, that single mothers can build empires, and that children who enter the world fighting never stop believing in miracles. She never spoke Drayson's name in front of the boys. When they asked about their father, which they hadn't yet but inevitably would, she planned to tell them the truth. Some people aren't ready for the gift of family, but that doesn't make the gift any less precious. Late at night, when both boys were finally sleeping and the cafe below was quiet, Zarella would look out her window at the Savannah squares draped in Spanish moss, and remember the woman she used to be. That woman had needed a man's approval to feel valuable, had measured her worth by someone else's interest, and had believed that love required sacrifice of self. This woman, the one shaped by premature births and midnight feedings and the daily choice to keep building something beautiful, knew better. She had learned that the most profound love doesn't diminish you, it reveals exactly how strong you were all along. On the twins' first birthday, as she watched them take tentative steps around the cafe while customers cheered, an envelope arrived addressed to Body Alchemy Cafe. Inside was an invitation printed on heavy cream cardstock with gold lettering. The Rosemont Foundation cordially invites you to cater our annual gala, recognizing outstanding contributions to child welfare and community development. At the bottom of the invitation, in smaller print, was the name that made her blood run. Cold and her spine straighten with determination, founder and chairman, Drayson Vale. Zarella looked at her sons, now walking and babbling and filling the cafe, with the kind of joy that made customers linger longer than they'd planned. She thought about the life they'd built together, the community that supported them, and the strength she'd discovered in herself over the past 2 years. Then she picked up her phone and called the number on the invitation. "We'd be honored to cater your event," she told the coordinator, her voice steady as steel. Because some conversations were 5 years in the making, and it was time to show a man who dismissed them as accidents exactly what miracles looked like when they grew up. Have you ever had someone write you off, only to come back stronger than they ever imagined possible? Share this if you believe that sometimes the people who underestimate us are just giving us the space we need to prove them wrong. The emerald silk gown had been her grandmother's, altered to fit perfectly and updated, with modern tailoring that made it look like it cost more than most people's cars. Zarella stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting the delicate gold jewelry that caught the light like captured starfire. At 31, she had learned the difference between dressing to impress and dressing to remind yourself of your own power. Tonight, she needed her power more than she'd needed anything in years. "Mama, you look like a princess," Taeyeon said from the doorway, his 5-year-old eyes wide with admiration. He wore a navy suit that made him look like a miniature businessman, complete with a clip-on tie he'd insisted on choosing himself. "Thank you, baby." Zarella knelt to adjust his collar, her hand steady despite the storm of emotions churning in her chest. "Remember what we talked about tonight? Stay close, use our inside voices, and shake hands like we mean business," Nalir recited from beside his brother. His hearing aids were nearly invisible, custom-fitted and designed to look like sophisticated earpieces rather than medical devices. He wore an identical navy suit, but had chosen a bow tie instead of a regular tie because it made him feel more fancy. "And if anyone asks us questions," Zarella prompted, "we smile and say our names and that our mama makes the best food in Savannah." Taeyeon finished, grinning to show the gap where he'd lost his first tooth the week before. Zarella's heart clenched with pride and protectiveness in equal measure. Her sons had no idea they were about to meet the man whose DNA they carried, but who had never shown interest in their existence. To them, this was just another catering job, another chance to help Mama work and meet new people. She'd been catering high-end events in Savannah for 3 years now, building a reputation that stretched from Atlanta to Charleston. Body Alchemy had evolved from a small cafe into a full-service wellness catering company that specialized in making healthy food that actually tasted incredible. Her client list included celebrities, politicians, and business leaders who flew her in specifically because she could create menus that were both nutritious and memorable. But this event was different. This was the Rosemont Foundation Gala, and she'd spent 5 years wondering if she'd ever cross paths with Drayson Vale again. When the invitation had arrived, she'd stared at it for 20 minutes, feeling like the universe was offering her a choice between hiding and healing. She'd chosen healing, which sometimes looked a lot like showing up. The ballroom at the mansion on Forsyth Park was everything she'd expected: crystal chandeliers, marble floors, and enough wealth concentrated in one space to solve most of the world's problems. Zarella had arrived 3 hours early with her catering team to set up, and she'd used that time to transform the space into something that reflected her vision rather than just her employer's expectations. Instead of traditional heavy hors d'oeuvres, she'd created a series of interactive food stations that encouraged mingling and conversation. Her team wore elegant black uniforms instead of typical catering whites, and every dish was designed to be both Instagram-worthy and genuinely nourishing. The menu featured Southern ingredients elevated with international techniques, telling The story of how diverse influences could create something entirely new and beautiful. By the time the guests began arriving, Zarella had positioned herself at the central beverage station where she could observe without being obvious about it. Her son sat at a small table near the kitchen, coloring in activity books. She'd brought to keep them occupied during the adult conversations. She saw him before he saw her. Drayson Vale entered the ballroom like he owned it, which he probably did in some financial sense. He looked exactly like she remembered, but somehow different, as if success had polished him into something shinier and more distant than the man she'd once known. His tuxedo was perfectly tailored, his hair was perfectly styled, and his smile was perfectly practiced. As he worked the room with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world, Zarella felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, no lingering attraction. Just a mild curiosity about how someone she'd once loved so completely could now feel like a stranger she'd read about in a magazine. The cocktail hour passed smoothly. Guests raved about the food. Her team executed flawlessly, and Zarella began to think she might make it through the entire evening without any drama. Her sons charmed everyone who stopped to talk to them, answering questions about their mamas cooking with a kind of earnest pride that made adults smile despite themselves. Then Drayson stepped up to the podium to deliver his speech, and everything changed. Zarella positioned herself at the back of the ballroom with her sons beside her, planning to listen politely and then begin the dinner service. But as Drayson began speaking about legacy and family values, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. His eyes were scanning the crowd, and when they landed on her section of the room, his expression changed completely. The practiced confidence faltered, his voice caught slightly, and for just a moment, he looked like a man who'd seen a ghost. But he hadn't just seen her. His gaze had moved from her face to the two little boys standing beside her, and she watched in real time as the color drained from his face. "Mama," Taeyeon whispered, tugging on her dress, "why is that man staring at us?" Before she could answer, Nalir looked directly at the stage and tilted, his head in that way he did when he was trying to figure out a puzzle. "He looks like us," he said, his voice carrying in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the back of the ballroom. Other guests began turning to see what had captured the speaker's attention. Zarella felt dozens of eyes moving between her sons and the man on stage, watching recognition dawn on faces throughout the crowd. The resemblance was unmistakable. Taeyeon had Drayson's jawline and intense stare. Nalir had his smile and the way he held his head when concentrating. Zarella made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of trying to blend into the background or hustle her sons out of the room, she guided them forward through the crowd toward the front of the ballroom. If this moment was going to happen, it would happen on her terms. Every step felt like walking through water, with conversations stopping and whispers following in their wake. Camera phones appeared, recording a drama that was unfolding in real time. But Zarella kept her chin high and her sons close, moving with the grace of someone who belonged exactly where she was. When they reached the front tables, a coordinator appeared with apologies about seating that hadn't been arranged. But Zarella smiled and guided her sons to seats that had mysteriously become available in the front row. Someone had clearly recognized what was happening and made space for them. From 3 feet away, the resemblance between Drayson and the boys was impossible to ignore. They sat quietly, coloring in their books, completely unaware that they'd just exploded. Their father's carefully controlled world, simply by existing in the same space as him. Drayson tried to continue his speech, but his voice was shaky and his hands were trembling as he gripped the podium. He kept losing his place, forgetting his lines, and glancing at the boys like he was trying to solve an equation that didn't make sense. Finally, Taeyeon looked up from his coloring book directly at the man on stage. Their eyes met across the distance, and Zarella watched her son's face light up with the kind of innocent recognition that children sometimes have for people they've never met but somehow know. Taeyeon raised his small hand and waved, just once, with the unself-conscious friendliness that made him impossible not to love. The gesture broke something in Drayson completely. The crystal glass in his hand slipped and shattered against the marble floor, the sound echoing through the ballroom like a gunshot. He stepped backward from the podium, his perfect composure cracking like ice in warm water. 500 guests watched the most powerful man in the room struggle to maintain control while 2 little boys colored peacefully. In the front row, completely unaware that their simple presence had just rewritten everyone's understanding of the evening, and Zarella sat between her sons, radiant in emerald silk, watching the man who'd once dismissed them as accidents. Discover that some truths are too powerful to be silenced by money or status or carefully constructed public images. 3 days after the gala explosion that had every social media platform buzzing with speculation, Drayson Vale sat in his lawyer's office, demanding answers to questions everyone already knew. The viral videos and photos had been dissected by entertainment blogs, financial news outlets, and gossip magazines from Atlanta to New York. The resemblance between him and the two boys was so striking that late night talk show hosts were making jokes about cloning technology. But Drayson wasn't laughing. He was spiraling. "I need definitive proof," he told his attorney Marcus Chen, while pacing behind the mahogany desk like a caged animal. "Those children could belong to anyone. The resemblance could be coincidental. I won't be manipulated by some elaborate scheme to extract money from me." Marcus had known Drayson for 8 years, had helped him navigate hostile takeovers and billion-dollar mergers. But he'd never seen him this rattled. The man who could read market trends like poetry and negotiate deals while others were still figuring out the stakes was completely undone by 2 5-year-old boys and their mother's calm confidence. "Drayson, I've seen the photos. The entire internet has seen the photos. Those children look exactly like your baby pictures. Even if you wanted to deny paternity, no court in America would believe you after what happened at that gala. Then we get a court-ordered DNA test. Make it official. Remove any doubt. And what exactly do you think that will accomplish?" Marcus leaned forward, studying his client with the kind of concern usually reserved for friends rather than billable hours. "Let's say the test confirms what everyone already knows. Then what? You've spent 5 years ignoring their existence. You can't exactly claim you've been a devoted father waiting for confirmation." Drayson stopped pacing and stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the Manhattan skyline. Somewhere down in those streets, people were living normal lives, making normal choices, dealing with normal problems. He envied them their simplicity. "I need to understand what she wants from me. This can't be a coincidence. She chose that catering job specifically. She's playing some kind of long game, and I need to know what the end game is before I make any decisions." "Or," Marcus said quietly, "she's just a woman trying to build a life for her children. And you happen to be the one hosting an event she was qualified to cater. Not everything is a conspiracy, Drayson. Sometimes life just happens." But Drayson couldn't accept that explanation, because it would mean accepting that he'd thrown away something irreplaceable based on fear rather than logic. It would mean admitting that the woman he'd dismissed as emotional and unrealistic had built exactly the kind of meaningful life he claimed to value, while he'd spent 5 years accumulating more wealth and less purpose. 2 weeks later, he found himself in Savannah, sitting in a rental car outside Body Alchemy Cafe like some kind of stalker. He told himself he was just gathering information, doing due diligence before making any formal contact. But the truth was simpler and more pathetic. He was trying to understand how the woman he'd left behind had become someone he barely recognized. The cafe buzzed with activity. Through the large windows, he could see young mothers nursing babies while working on laptops, elderly couples sharing healthy lunches, and teenagers getting nutrition advice that came with genuine encouragement rather than judgment. The space radiated warmth and community in ways that made his sterile Manhattan offices feel like museums. And there was Zarella, moving through it all like she was conducting an orchestra. She'd gained confidence in the years since he'd known her, grown into a leadership role that seemed as natural as breathing. She listened to customers with complete attention, solved problems with quick efficiency, and made everyone around her feel valued and heard. She was magnificent, and he'd been too young and stupid to recognize it when it mattered. The boys appeared around 3 in the afternoon, fresh from kindergarten, and full of energy that transformed the cafe's atmosphere completely. Customers who'd been quietly working suddenly became animated, engaging, with the children like they were everyone's favorite nephews. Taeyeon was clearly the more outgoing twin, chatting with regular customers about his day and showing off artwork from school. Nalir was quieter but intensely observant, helping his mother by clearing tables and organizing supplies, with the kind of systematic precision that reminded Drayson uncomfortably of himself at that age. They were good kids, happy, polite, confident in their place in the world. Everything he would have wanted in children, if he'd ever been brave enough to want children at all. "Sir, are you okay?" The voice at his car window startled him completely. He looked up to find Nalir standing beside the rental car, his small face serious with concern. "You've been sitting here for a long time, and Mama says when people sit in cars too long without getting out, sometimes they need help." Drayson's mouth went dry. Up close, looking at Nalir was like staring into a funhouse mirror that showed his own childhood reflected back at him. The same dark eyes, the same thoughtful expression, the same way of tilting his head when trying to solve a problem. "I'm fine," he managed to say, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "Just thinking about some things." "Are you thinking about sad things? Because when I think about sad things too long, Mama makes me hot chocolate, and we talk about happy things instead. Do you want me to get my mama?" The innocent offer hit Drayson like a physical blow. This child, who had no idea who he was offering comfort to a stranger because that's what his mother had taught him to do. Kindness as a default response, generosity without expectation of reward. "No, that's okay," Drayson said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "But thank you for asking." "That's very kind of you." Nalir studied him for another moment, then brightened with sudden recognition. "You look familiar. Do you know my mama? You have the same chin as me and Taeyeon." Before Drayson could figure out how to respond to that observation, Zarella appeared at the cafe door, her expression shifting from concern to something harder when she recognized him sitting in the car. "Nalir, baby, come inside, please," she called, her voice calm but firm. "It's time for your snack." The little boy waved goodbye and trotted back to his mother, who guided him inside without another glance in Drayson's direction. But her message was clear. She'd seen him watching, and she wasn't intimidated. That evening, Drayson called the number he'd memorized but never had the courage to dial. "Body Alchemy Cafe, this is Zarella speaking." Her voice was exactly as he remembered, warm and professional, with an undertone of steel that suggested she could handle whatever came next. "It's Drayson," he said simply. Silence stretched between them like a bridge neither was sure they wanted to cross. "I figured you'd call eventually," she said finally. "What do you want?" "I want to know if they're mine." "You have eyes, Drayson. Use them." "I want official confirmation, DNA testing, legal documentation." Another pause, longer this time. When she spoke again, her voice carried the kind of quiet fury that was more dangerous than shouting. "Let me make something very clear to you. Those boys are not a problem to be solved or assets to be verified. They are human beings who have lived perfectly complete lives without you for 5 years. If you want to be part of their world, you earn that privilege. You don't demand it. I'm not demanding anything. I'm trying to be responsible here." "Responsible?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Responsible would have been answering your phone 5 years ago. Responsible would have been showing up when they spent 6 weeks in the NICU fighting to breathe. Responsible would have been helping me figure out how to afford hearing aids and therapy, and all the other things that come with raising premature twins. Don't talk to me about being responsible now. Drayson closed his eyes, feeling the weight of every choice he'd made and every choice he'd avoided. "What do you want from me, Zarella?" "I want you to decide what kind of man you actually are," she said. "Because if you're the kind who needs a DNA test to recognize his own children, then we don't need you in our lives. And if you're the kind who can look past your fear long enough to see what you've been missing, then maybe we can have a conversation. And if the test proves they're not mine, then you can go back to your life of accumulating money and avoiding anything that might require actual courage. But Drayson, deep down, you already know the answer. The question is whether you're brave enough to live with it." The line went dead, leaving him alone with the echo of her words and the growing certainty that he was about to make the most important decision of his life. Because DNA tests could prove biological connections, but they couldn't prove the capacity for love. And after 5 years of running from the truth, Drayson was finally ready to stop hiding behind legal documents and start facing the man he'd become when nobody was watching. The next morning he drove to the cafe again, but this time, instead of sitting in the car like a coward, he walked through the front door and asked the most terrifying question of his adult life. "Can we talk? Have you ever had to prove you were worthy of something you should have claimed from the beginning? Drop a comment if you think some mistakes take a lifetime to fix, and let us know, is it ever too late to become the person you were supposed to be?" The community center playroom smelled like crayons and hand sanitizer, with afternoon sunlight streaming through windows covered in children's artwork. Drayson sat in a plastic chair designed for someone half his size, watching Taeyeon and Nalir play with building blocks while Zarella observed from a table 10 feet away. This was their compromise, supervised visits in neutral territory with clear boundaries and no expectations beyond basic human decency. It had been 3 weeks since their phone conversation, and Drayson had agreed to her terms without argument. No lawyers, no DNA tests, no attempts to establish legal rights he hadn't earned. Just time spent getting to know the children he'd helped create but never bothered to meet. "You're building that wrong," Taeyeon announced, watching Drayson attempt to construct something that might have been a tower or possibly just a pile of colorful plastic. "The big blocks go on the bottom, not the top. That's baby building." "Sorry," Drayson said, genuinely apologetic. "I'm not very good at this." "That's okay," Nalir said, his voice gentle in the way that suggested he was used to helping people feel better about their mistakes. "Mama says practice makes progress, not perfect. Do you want me to show you how?" For the next 20 minutes, Drayson received building instruction from his 5-year-old son, learning architectural principles he'd somehow missed despite owning several construction companies. Nalir was patient and encouraging, celebrating small victories and offering gentle corrections when necessary. Taeyeon was less forgiving. He watched Drayson with the kind of suspicious assessment that suggested he'd inherited more than just physical features from his biological father. Every movement, every word, every gesture was being evaluated and filed away for future reference. "Are you rich?" Taeyeon asked suddenly, his direct question cutting through the polite small talk that had filled most of their previous meetings. "Taeyeon," Zarella called from her table, a warning in her voice. "It's okay," Drayson said, looking at his son with respect for the directness he recognized in himself. "Yes, I have a lot of money. Then why don't you live with us? Rich people can live wherever they want." The innocent logic was devastating in its simplicity. Drayson felt his carefully prepared explanations crumble under the weight of a child's honesty. "It's complicated," he said finally. "No, it's not," Taeyeon replied with 5-year-old certainty. "Either you want to be with someone or you don't. Mama says complicated is just another word for scared." Drayson glanced at Zarella, who was pretending to read a magazine while clearly listening to every word. She'd armed these children with wisdom that cut straight through adult deception, and he was beginning to understand that this was intentional. "You're right," he admitted. "I was scared." "Of what?" "We're just kids. We're not scary. I was scared of being a bad daddy, of not knowing how to take care of you properly." Nalir looked up from the blocks he'd been arranging in careful patterns. "But if you never try, you never get good at it. That's what Mama tells us about everything. She's right about that too." "Are you still scared?" Taeyeon asked, his dark eyes intense with the kind of focus that made adults uncomfortable. Drayson considered lying, offering some reassuring platitude that would make everyone feel better. But these children had been raised on honesty, and they deserved nothing less from him. "Yes," he said quietly. "I'm terrified." "Good," Taeyeon said, nodding with satisfaction. "Mama says brave people are still scared. They just do the right thing anyway." The conversation continued for another hour, covering topics from favorite foods to bedtime stories to why Nalir needed hearing aids and whether they hurt. The boys were curious about everything, generous with their attention, and surprisingly forgiving of his obvious inexperience with children. But as the visit wound down, Taeyeon's demeanor shifted. He became quieter, more withdrawn, watching Drayson with an expression that seemed far too mature for his age. "Can I ask you something?" Taeyeon said as they were cleaning up the blocks. "Of course." "Why didn't you want us when we were babies?" The question hit like a physical blow, delivered with the kind of innocent honesty that cut deeper than any accusation. Drayson looked at this beautiful, brilliant child who carried his features, and wondered how to explain choices he could barely understand himself. He started, then stopped, realizing that anything he said would sound like an excuse to someone who'd never had the luxury of choosing whether to love his family. "We were in the hospital for a long time," Taeyeon continued, his voice matter-of-fact but his eyes watchful. "Mama showed us pictures. We were really small and had to stay in special beds with machines to help us breathe. She says that's when families are supposed to come together and help each other. But you weren't there." Drayson felt something break inside his chest, a pain so sharp and unexpected that he couldn't breathe properly. He looked at Nalir, who was watching him with concern, then at Taeyeon, who was waiting for an answer with the patience of someone who'd been waiting his entire life. "I should have been there," he said, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "I should have been there for all of it. I should have been holding your mother's hand when she was scared, and sitting beside your beds when you were, learning to breathe, and reading you stories when you came home. I should have been there, and I wasn't. And that's the biggest mistake I've ever made in my life." Tears he hadn't cried since childhood began flowing before he could stop them. Not the careful, controlled emotion of a businessman managing a difficult conversation, but the raw, overwhelming grief of someone finally understanding what he'd lost. "I don't know how to be a daddy," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never had a good example, and I was so afraid of hurting you that I hurt you worse by staying away. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Nalir moved closer, his small hand reaching out to touch Drayson's face with the gentle concern he'd shown in the car that day. "You're crying like me," he said softly. "I cry when I'm sad about things I can't change. But some things can change," Taeyeon added, his voice thoughtful. "If you want to learn how to be our daddy now, maybe you could practice. Mama says everything gets easier with practice." Drayson looked at these two extraordinary children who had every reason to reject him and were instead offering him hope he didn't deserve. He thought about all the years he'd wasted, all the moments he'd missed, all the bedtime stories he'd never read and scraped knees he'd never kissed better. "Would you like that?" he asked. "If I learned how to be your daddy?" "Only if you really want to," Taeyeon said with a kind of serious consideration. That suggested he'd thought about this conversation many times. "Because if you change your mind again, it would hurt too much." "I won't change my mind," Drayson said, looking directly into his sons, eyes with the first promise he'd ever made that felt like a sacred vow. "I can't promise I'll be good at it right away, but I promise I won't leave again." "Okay," Taeyeon said simply. "But you have to promise Mama too, not just us." They both looked toward the table where Zarella sat, no longer pretending to read. Her face was streaked with tears she hadn't bothered to hide, and her expression was a mixture of pain and possibility that made Drayson's heart ache with regret for all the time they'd lost. "Mama," Nalir called softly. "He wants to learn how to be our daddy. Do you think that's okay?" Zarella walked over to where they sat, surrounded by scattered building blocks and honest conversation. She knelt down to be at eye level with all three of them, her sons and the man who was finally ready to become their father. "Daddies aren't just for playing with," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "They're for middle-of-the-night fevers and homework help and teaching you how to be good men. They're for every day, not just the easy ones. Are you sure that's what you want?" Drayson looked at her, then at his sons, then back at her. For the first time in 5 years, he knew exactly what he wanted and exactly what it would cost him. "Yes," he said, "I want all of it. The hard parts, the scary parts, the parts I don't know how to do yet. I want to be their father, and I want to earn your forgiveness, and I want to spend the rest of my life making up for the time I wasted being afraid." "Then you can start by reading us a story," Taeyeon said practically. "Mama always reads to us before dinner, but she says different voices make stories better." As Drayson reached for the picture book Nalir handed him, his hands shaking slightly with nervousness and hope, he realized that redemption didn't come with guarantees or contracts or legal documentation. It came with small moments, daily choices, and the terrifying courage to love someone more than you loved your own comfort. But as he opened to the first page and saw 2 little boys settle beside him with the trust he'd never earned but was being given anyway, he understood that some gifts were worth any amount of fear. The story was about a lost prince who had to learn how to be brave, and as Drayson read it in voices that made his sons giggle with delight, he wondered if fairy tales were just practice for the real magic that happened when people decided to love each other despite everything that made it complicated. 6 weeks into their cautious experiment with supervised visits, Zarella found herself doing something she'd sworn she'd never do, considering letting Drayson into her real life instead of keeping him contained in neutral spaces. The change hadn't happened overnight, but through accumulated moments. That added up to something that might, eventually, become trust. He'd shown up for every scheduled visit, arriving early and staying late when the boys wanted to finish whatever game or conversation had captured their attention. He'd learned their routines, their preferences, their quirks. Taeyeon liked his sandwiches cut diagonally and became cranky when his blood sugar dropped. Nalir needed extra time to process verbal instructions and felt more confident when people looked directly at him while speaking. Small details that loving parents learned through daily presence, not weekend visits. But Drayson was trying to compress 5 years of missed knowledge into crash course sessions, and his dedication was both impressive and heartbreaking to watch. "Mama," Nalir said one afternoon as they walked home from the community center, "can Drayson come to our house sometime? I want to show him my rock collection." The request was innocent, but it represented a boundary Zarella hadn't been ready to cross. Her home was their sanctuary, the space where she and the boys existed without performance or compromise. Inviting Drayson into that space felt like giving him access to something sacred. "We'll see, baby," she said, the universal parent response that meant, "I need time to think about this." But that evening, as she tucked the boys into their beds and listened to their prayers, she found herself reconsidering. They were asking about their father with increasing frequency, not just during visits, but during ordinary moments throughout their days. At breakfast, Taeyeon wondered what kind of cereal Drayson liked. During bath time, Nalier speculated about whether their father had the same birthmark on his shoulder that they both carried. They were trying to piece together an understanding of themselves through fragments of information about a man they were just beginning to know, and keeping him at arm's length might be protecting her, but it wasn't serving them. The next week, she made a decision that terrified and empowered her in equal measure. "Would you like to come for dinner on Sunday?" she asked Drayson at the end of their community center visit. "Nothing fancy, just what we normally do, but the boys have been asking, and I think maybe it's time." Drayson's face lit up with an expression of gratitude so intense it made her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "Are you sure?" "No," she said honestly, "but I'm willing to try." Sunday dinner at the Body Alchemy Cafe's upstairs apartment was chaos, orchestrated by love and held together by routine. The boys helped set the table while Zarella finished cooking, their chatter filling the small space with energy that bounced off walls decorated with their artwork and family photos. Drayson arrived with flowers for Zarella and small gifts for the boys, geology books for Nalier's rock obsession and a set of building blocks more sophisticated than anything they'd used at the community center for Taeyeon's architectural interests. The gifts were thoughtful without being excessive, showing he'd been paying attention to their interests rather than trying to buy their affection. "Can you help me mash the potatoes?" Zarella asked him, offering a task that would keep him occupied while she finished the rest of the meal. "Fair warning, I don't use a masher. We do everything by hand in this kitchen." For the next 20 minutes, Drayson learned to cook the way Zarella had learned from her grandmother, with intuition, conversation, and the understanding that meals were about more than nutrition. They were about gathering, sharing, creating the kind of warmth that made a house feel like a home. "You're actually good at this," she observed, watching him fold ingredients together with surprising gentleness. "I wouldn't have expected someone who lives on takeout and restaurant meals to have any kitchen instincts. I used to cook with my grandmother when I was little," he admitted, his hands stilling for a moment. "Before my parents decided it was beneath my station to spend time in the kitchen with the help, I'd forgotten how much I missed it." It was the first personal detail about his childhood he'd shared, and Zarella felt a small shift in her understanding of him. Beneath the wealth and privilege was someone who'd also lost connection to the simple pleasures that made life meaningful. Dinner was revelation disguised as ordinary family time. The boys dominated the conversation, telling Drayson about school projects and playground politics, with the kind of detailed storytelling that made adult concerns seem suddenly trivial. He listened with complete attention, asking follow-up questions and offering opinions when invited. When Nalier struggled to cut his chicken, Drayson helped without being asked. When Taeyeon spilled juice on his shirt, Drayson handed him a napkin and shared a story about ruining his own clothes at important business dinners. Small gestures, but they added up to presence rather than performance. "Can we show him our rooms now?" Taeyeon asked as they finished eating. "After we clean up," Zarella said, beginning to clear dishes. "Everyone helps in this family." Drayson joined the cleanup without hesitation, learning the rhythm of their evening routine. Dishes were washed by hand because the dishwasher was broken and replacement wasn't in the budget. Leftovers were carefully stored because food wasn't wasted in their household. Every small economy spoke to realities he'd never had to consider. But instead of seeming overwhelmed by the simplicity, he appeared fascinated by the efficiency. This family functioned with precision born of necessity, love expressed through practical care rather than expensive gestures. The tour of the boys' bedroom revealed a shared space made magical through creativity rather than money. Bunk beds with handmade curtains for privacy, a reading corner created with cushions and good lighting, walls covered with artwork, family photos, and a growth chart that tracked their progress through careful pencil marks. "This is my rock collection," Nalier announced proudly, gesturing to shelves lined with specimens organized by color, size, and origin. "Mama helps me research where they come from and what makes them special." "This is impressive," Drayson said, examining a piece of quartz with genuine interest. "Do you have a favorite?" "This one," Nalier pointed to a small, unremarkable stone near the front of the display. "It's from the beach where Mama told us about you for the first time. She said, "Sometimes special things look ordinary until you understand their story." The comment landed with unexpected weight, and Zarella felt heat rise in her cheeks. She'd had that conversation with the boys 2 years ago, trying to give them context for why they didn't have a father without making him into either a villain or a fantasy. "And this is my building corner," Taeyeon said, moving to a section of the room dominated by elaborate structures created from blocks, cardboard, and impressive imagination. "I'm designing a house for our family. Want to see?" The model was sophisticated beyond his years, complete with multiple levels, detailed rooms, and careful attention to functionality. But what caught Drayson's attention was the extra bedroom carefully positioned between what were obviously the master suite and children's areas. "What's this room for?" he asked, pointing to the addition. "That's your room," Taeyeon said matter-of-factly, "for when you're ready to live with us instead of just visiting. Mama says we shouldn't assume things about people's choices, but I figured you'd want your own space until you decide if you want to stay forever." The innocence of the statement hit Drayson like a physical blow. This child had been designing a future that included him, planning space in their lives, while he'd been struggling to figure out whether he belonged in their present. "It's perfect," he said, his voice rougher than intended. "Better than any house I've ever lived in." Bedtime routine was another revelation in the ordinary magic of family life. Baths were supervised but independent, pajamas were chosen by personal preference, and teeth were brushed, with the kind of negotiation that made Zarella wonder how she'd ever had patience for difficult clients. "Story time," she announced once everyone was clean and ready for sleep. "Who wants to pick tonight's book?" "Can Drayson read to us?" Nalir asked. "He does good voices, and I want to hear the story about the dragon who was afraid of fire." As Drayson settled into the reading chair with both boys curled against him, Zarella felt something shift in her chest. This scene looked right in a way that scared and comforted her simultaneously. Her sons relaxed into his presence like they'd been doing this their entire lives, and he held them, with the careful reverence of someone who understood how precious and fragile this moment was. The story was about a dragon who had to learn courage, but as Zarella listened from the doorway, she thought it could have been about anyone learning to love despite being afraid of getting burned. When the boys finally fell asleep, she and Drayson moved to the small living room, where the silence felt different than it had in months of supervised visits. This was domestic quiet, the comfortable exhaustion that followed family time, rather than the careful politeness of strangers getting to know each other. "Thank you," he said simply, "for letting me see how you really live, for trusting me with this." "Don't thank me yet," she replied, settling onto the opposite end of the small couch. This was the easy part. Real family life isn't always Sunday dinners and bedtime stories. It's also middle-of-the-night fevers and grocery store meltdowns and homework battles that test your patience and sanity. "I want all of it," he said without hesitation. "The hard parts, the boring parts, the parts that don't look like anything special from the outside. I want to be here for the ordinary moments, not just the occasions that feel meaningful." Zarella studied his face, looking for signs of the polished insincerity she'd learned to recognize in their earlier relationship. But all she saw was exhaustion and honesty, the vulnerability of someone who'd finally stopped performing and started being real. "They called me Dad tonight," he continued, his voice soft with wonder. Not Drayson, not their father, but Dad, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Children forgive faster than adults," she said. "They don't have the same capacity for holding grudges or protecting themselves from disappointment. But Drayson, that also means they're more vulnerable to being hurt. If you're going to be in their lives, you have to be all in. There's no halfway with children's hearts." "I understand. I hope you do, because I won't let you leave them again. Once you commit to being their father, that's it, forever. Even if things get complicated between us, even if we disagree about everything else, they come first. Always." He nodded, the weight of her words settling between them like a contract written in something more binding than legal language. "What about you?" he asked quietly. "What do you need from me?" The question surprised her with its directness. For months, their conversations had focused entirely on the boys, their needs, their adjustment, their feelings. Nobody had asked what she needed, what she wanted, what would make this arrangement work for her. "I need consistency," she said after a moment. "I need honesty, even when it's uncomfortable. And I need to know that you're doing this because you want to be a father, not because you feel obligated or guilty or want to repair your public image." "It started with guilt," he admitted, "but it's not about that anymore. I love them, Zarella. I love who they are and who they're becoming, and I love the way they make me want to be better than I thought I could be. I can't imagine my life without them anymore. And what about me? She asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Where do I fit in your vision of family life? The silence stretched between them, loaded with 5 years of history and the complexity of two people trying to build something new from the pieces of what they'd destroyed. I don't know, he said finally, and his honesty was more reassuring than any practiced answer could have been. I know I hurt you in ways I'm still learning to understand. I know I threw away something precious because I was too scared to recognize what it was. And know that earning your forgiveness is going to be the hardest thing I've ever done. You're right about that. But I also know that watching you with them, seeing the mother you became and the life you built, makes me remember why I fell in love with you in the first place. You're extraordinary, Zarella. You always were. I was just too young and selfish to appreciate what I had. The confession hung between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross. Too much had been broken, too much time had passed, and too much was at stake to rush toward anything that resembled their old relationship. But as Drayson prepared to leave, kissing his sleeping sons goodnight and promising to call them, in the morning, Zarella allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to trust him again. Not with her heart, not yet, but with the daily realities of raising children who deserve to know their father. Same time next week? He asked at the door. Same time next week, she agreed. But Drayson? Next time you're helping with bath time and homework. No more easy visits where everything is perfect and manageable. If you want to be their father, you're going to learn what that actually means. He smiled, the first completely genuine expression she'd seen from him since they'd reunited. I wouldn't want it any other way. As she watched him drive away, Zarella pressed her hand to the window and wondered, if redemption always felt this terrifying and hopeful at the same time, have you ever had to learn to trust someone who broke your heart, not for your own sake but for your children's? Share this if you believe that families can be rebuilt one ordinary moment at a time, and tell us, what does forgiveness look like in your life? 8 months had passed since that first supervised visit, and Drayson Vale had become a fixture in the daily rhythm of their lives. He attended parent-teacher conferences, helped with homework battles, and had mastered the art of negotiating bedtime with 2 strong-willed 5-year-olds who'd inherited his stubborn streak. What had started as careful co-parenting had evolved into something that looked suspiciously like a family, even though nobody had been brave enough to name it. Tonight felt different, though. The boys had gone to sleep easily after a day spent at the zoo, tired from adventure, and secure in the knowledge that both their parents would be there when they woke up. For the first time since this careful reconstruction had begun, Zarella and Drayson found themselves alone in her kitchen without an agenda or timeline, sharing a bottle of wine and the comfortable exhaustion that followed successful family time. I never understood why people talked about wine tasting like anything other than wine, Drayson said, swirling the burgundy liquid in his glass. But this actually does taste like cherries and something I can't identify. Tobacco and leather, Zarella supplied, settling back in her chair with the relaxation that came from knowing her children were safe and happy. It's a Côte d'Oron from a vineyard I visited during my semester abroad. I save it for special occasions. What makes tonight special? The question was innocent enough, but it carried weight they'd both been avoiding for months. Tonight marked the first time Taeyeon and Nalir had fallen asleep calling him Dad without any self-consciousness or hesitation. Tonight was the first time Drayson had stayed for dinner without it feeling like a scheduled appointment. Tonight was the first time they'd relaxed into each other's presence without the careful politeness that had characterized their rebuilding relationship. They called you Dad today, she said simply. Not Drayson, not their father. Dad. Like it was the most natural thing in the world. I noticed. His smile was soft, unguarded in a way that reminded her of the man she'd fallen in love with before fear had turned him into someone she didn't recognize. Taeyeon did it first, when he was explaining to that kid at the zoo why we all had the same eyes. Just casually, like he'd been saying it his whole life. And Nalir picked it up immediately. They do that, mirror each other's language until they're both saying the same thing. They're incredible kids, Zarella. What you've done, raising them on your own, building this life. He gestured around the kitchen that smelled like home-cooked meals and sounded like laughter. I don't think I fully appreciated what I'd missed until I started living it. The wine was making him philosophical, softening the edges of conversations they'd been too careful to have sober. Zarella found herself studying his face in the soft kitchen lighting, noting changes that had nothing to do with age. The permanent tension around his eyes had relaxed. His smile reached places it hadn't before. He looked like someone who'd learned to prioritize joy over achievement. "What's different?" she asked. "You seem, I don't know, more like yourself. More like the person I thought you were before everything fell apart." Drayson considered the question, rolling it around like the wine on his tongue. "I think I stopped trying to be someone else's version of successful. For years I was performing this role I thought I was supposed to play, the ruthless businessman, the guy who could make hard choices without getting emotional, the person who measured everything by profit margins and strategic advantage. And now I measure things by whether they make my sons laugh, by whether they make their mother smile, by whether I can look at myself in the mirror and like the person looking back." He paused, meeting her eyes with an intensity that made her chest tighten. "By whether I'm becoming someone worthy of the family I almost threw away." The honesty was dangerous, cutting through months of careful boundary setting and protective distance. Zarella felt her resolve wavering in ways that terrified and thrilled her. "Drayson," she started, but he held up a hand. "I know we're not there yet. I know I have years of trust to rebuild and no right to expect forgiveness, let alone anything more. But Zarella, I need you to know that falling in love with our sons has reminded me why I fell in love with you in the first place." "Don't," she said, but without the firmness the word required to be effective. "You're brilliant in ways that have nothing to do with academic achievement. You see possibilities where other people see problems. You've taken every challenge life has thrown at you and transformed it into something that serves other people. You've created magic from scratch, built a community from nothing, raised two extraordinary human beings while making it look effortless. It's not effortless. Most days I'm barely keeping it together. But you are keeping it together. You're thriving. You've built exactly the kind of meaningful life I used to dismiss as impractical sentiment." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. "I was an idiot, Zarella, a scared, selfish idiot who couldn't recognize the best thing that ever happened to him. The wine and the late hour and the weight of 8 months watching him gradually become the father Dee always hoped he could be were combining into something that felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. One step forward would change everything. One step backward would preserve the careful balance they'd built. "I can't," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Can't what?" "Can't do this again. Can't risk everything we've built for the boys on the possibility that you've actually changed. Can't survive having my heart broken by you twice. I have changed." His voice carried absolute certainty, but not in the ways you might think. "I'm not suddenly perfect or completely different from who I was. I'm still driven, still analytical, still someone who thinks too much and feels too little. Sometimes. But I've learned the difference between being successful and being worthy. I've learned that the only achievements that matter are the ones that make the people you love proud to know you." Zarella stared into her wine glass, watching the liquid swirl like the emotions churning in her chest. "What are you asking me, Drayson?" "I'm asking if there's any possibility that someday, maybe not today or tomorrow, but someday, you might be willing to trust me with your heart again, not just as the father of your children, but as someone who loves you completely and wants to. Spend the rest of his life proving that love through action rather than words." The silence stretched between them, filled with everything they'd been, too careful to say, and everything they were too afraid to hope for. Outside, Savannah settled into late-night quiet, but inside their small kitchen, the future hung in balance. "I don't know," she said finally, and it was the most honest answer she could give. "I don't know if I can separate the man you are now from the man who hurt me before. I don't know if what I'm feeling is real or just nostalgia mixed with wine and exhaustion. And I don't know if I'm strong enough to risk everything again. You don't have to know," he said gently. "You don't have to decide anything tonight or make any promises about tomorrow. I'm not going anywhere, Zarella. Whether we're co-parents or friends or something more, I'm committed to this family for life. There's no pressure, no timeline, no expectation beyond what we have right now." She looked at him then, really looked, seeing past the expensive clothes and careful grooming to the man underneath. He was different, fundamentally changed in ways that went deeper than improved parenting skills or modified priorities. The brittle edges had been worn smooth by love and responsibility and the daily choice to put other people's needs before his own comfort. "I used to dream about this," she admitted. "In those early days after the boys were born, when I was exhausted and overwhelmed and missing you despite everything that had happened. I used to imagine you showing up and being everything I'd hoped you could be, What happened in those dreams? Usually I told you it was too late, that you'd missed your chance and we'd moved on without you. She smiled sadly. I was so angry for so long I couldn't imagine anything else. And now I'm not angry anymore. I'm cautious and scared and protective of what we've built, but I'm not angry. And that terrifies me more than the anger ever did, because anger was armor. This feels like standing naked in the rain. Drayson reached across the small table, not to touch her but to place his hand near hers, offering connection without demanding it. I know I don't deserve another chance. I know I threw away something precious and I have no right to expect to get it back. But if you're ever ready, if you ever decide you want to try again, I promise you'll never doubt my commitment. To you, to the boys, to this family we're building together. Zarella stared at his hand so close to hers, remembering what it felt like to trust someone completely. The wine and the hour and the weight of watching him become the father she'd always hoped he could be were making her brave in ways that probably weren't wise. Ask me again in 6 months, she said quietly. When the novelty of family life is worn off, and you've dealt with real problems and ordinary stresses, when you've had time to be sure this isn't just guilt or nostalgia or wanting something because you can't have it. And if I ask you in 6 months, I don't know what I'll say, but I promise I'll give you an honest answer. He nodded, accepting her terms with the patience of someone who'd learned that the best things were worth waiting for. 6 months it is. As they sat in comfortable silence, finishing their wine and listening to the old house settle, around them, Zarella allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to trust him again. Not just as a father or co-parent, but as the man who'd once made her believe in forever before. Teaching her that some people weren't ready for the responsibility that came with being loved. But people could change. She was living proof of that, and maybe, just maybe, he was too. I should go, he said finally, though neither of them moved to end the evening. You should, she agreed, making no effort to clear the wine glasses or escort him to the door. Will you walk me out? In a minute. They sat in the quiet kitchen for another 10 minutes, neither speaking but both reluctant, to end a conversation that had changed everything without changing anything at all. Finally, Drayson stood and carried his wine glass to the sink, washing it carefully and setting it in the drying rack with the domestic familiarity of someone who belonged in this space. At the door, he paused and looked back at her. Thank you, for tonight, for the past 8 months, for giving me the chance to become someone worthy of them, of you. Don't make me regret it, she said, but without the warning edge the words should have carried. I won't. After he left, Zarella stood in her kitchen and finished her wine alone, thinking about second chances and the difference between forgiveness and trust. Outside her window, Spanish moss swayed in the summer breeze, and somewhere in the distance, church bells chimed midnight. 6 months felt like forever and no time at all. But maybe, if she was very lucky and he was very patient and they were both very careful with the fragile thing growing, between them, it would be just enough time to figure out whether some love stories deserve a second chapter. 1 year and 3 days after the night that changed everything, Drayson Vale stood backstage at the Rosemont Foundation Gala, adjusting his tie with hands that were steady for the first time in memory. The same crystal chandeliers cast the same golden light across the same marble floors, but everything else had transformed completely. The foundation itself had evolved under new leadership that prioritized community impact over tax benefits. Instead of writing checks to feel philanthropic, they'd restructured their entire approach to focus on sustainable change through direct partnership with grassroots organizations. Body Alchemy Cafe had become their flagship nutrition program, with Zarella designing wellness initiatives that were being replicated in underserved communities across the Southeast. But the biggest change wasn't in the foundation's mission or the ballroom's setup or even the guest list that now included community leaders alongside billionaire donors. The biggest change was in the man preparing to address the crowd from the same podium where he had once lost his composure so completely that video clips had become internet memes for months. 5 minutes, Mr. Vale, the event coordinator said, appearing beside him, with the kind of efficient energy that kept high-end galas running smoothly. Thank you, Maria, Drayson replied, checking his watch and glancing toward the ballroom entrance. Has the Baptiste family arrived yet? They're in the green room with the other honored guests, she said with a smile that suggested she was one of many people who'd been following their story with invested interest. Your sons asked me to tell you they're wearing their fancy listening faces tonight. Drayson laughed, recognizing Taeyeon's phrase for the expression they wore during important grown-up conversations they didn't fully understand but knew they were supposed to take seriously. At 6 years old, the twins had developed distinct personalities while maintaining the close bond that had helped them survive their difficult start in the world. Taeyeon had grown into a natural leader with strong opinions and the confidence to express them. He asked hard questions, challenged assumptions, and had recently informed his kindergarten teacher that traditional family structures were too limiting for creative people. He wanted to be an architect like his building blocks suggested, but also a chef like his mama, and maybe a businessman like his dad, but the kind who helps people instead of just making money. Nalir had emerged as the family diplomat, equally comfortable mediating playground disputes, and charming elderly cafe customers with his thoughtful observations about the world. His hearing aids had become conversation starters rather than sources of self-consciousness, and he'd developed a talent for reading people's emotions that served him well in navigating complex family dynamics. He wanted to be a teacher, a scientist, and a feelings doctor who helped people understand why they made the choices they made. Both boys had inherited their parents' intelligence and their grandmother's wisdom, creating a combination that was equal parts delightful and exhausting for the adults trying to keep up with their rapid development. "Mr. Vale," Maria prompted gently. "It's time." Drayson walked to the wings of the stage where he could see the ballroom filling with familiar faces and new ones. The crowd was different this year, more diverse in every way that mattered, representing the kind of inclusive community the Foundation was working to build rather than just the exclusive circle that could afford $1,000-a-plate dinners. And there, at a front table that had been reserved specifically for them, sat his family. Zarella wore midnight blue silk that made her skin glow like starlight, her natural hair styled in an elegant updo that showcased the simple diamond earrings he'd given her for Christmas. She looked like royalty, but more importantly, she looked happy. The careful tension that had marked her early rebuilding phase had given way to genuine comfort with the life they were creating together. The boys flanked her in matching charcoal gray suits, their hair neatly styled but not slicked down, their faces bright with excitement about being included in such an important grown-up event. Taeyeon waved when he spotted his father in the wings, a gesture that made half the ballroom turn to see what had captured his attention. Nalir offered a more subtle thumbs up, accompanied by the kind of encouraging smile that suggested he understood his dad might be nervous and wanted to offer support. 6 months ago, Drayson had asked Zarella the question that had been building between them since that wine-soaked conversation in her kitchen, not with grand romantic gestures or expensive rings, but during an ordinary Tuesday evening while they were cleaning up after dinner and the boys were arguing about whose turn it was to choose the bedtime story. "I love you," he'd said simply, pausing with a dish towel in his hands and soap suds on his sleeves. "I love the life we've built and the people we've become and the way you make everything better just by being yourself. I love our boys and this chaotic, beautiful family and the way you've taught me that wealth means having enough love to share. And I want to spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worthy of all of it." She'd looked at him for a long moment, studying his face with the careful attention she gave to important decisions. Then she'd smiled, the first completely unguarded expression he'd seen from her since their reunion, and said, "I love you too." Scared, complicated, trying to figure it out love, but love nonetheless. "We'll figure out the rest as we go." They weren't engaged or officially living together, but they were something better, a family that had chosen each other deliberately, carefully, with full understanding of what they were committing to build together. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Drayson Vale, chairman of the Rosemont Foundation." The applause was warm but not overwhelming as Drayson walked to the podium, carrying note cards he'd written and rewritten dozens of times before finally deciding to speak from the heart instead of a script. "Last year," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the ballroom, "I stood on this stage and talked about legacy while having no real understanding of what the word meant. I thought legacy was about what you accumulated, what institutions bore your name, what monuments you left behind after you were gone." The crowd was attentive but not yet engaged, still settling into their seats and finishing conversations. But Drayson's eyes were fixed on his family, drawing strength from their presence. "I was wrong about that. Like I was wrong about a lot of things. Legacy isn't what you build for the history books. It's what you build for the people who will remember your daily choices long after the speeches are forgotten." Now he had their attention. Conversations quieted, and the room's energy shifted toward the stage. "This year, instead of talking about philanthropy as an abstract concept, I want to tell you about what I've learned from the people who've taught me what generosity actually means. For the next 20 minutes, Drayson shared stories that had nothing to do with tax-deductible donations or board positions. He talked about Zarella creating a sliding-scale nutrition program that fed families regardless of their ability to pay. He described watching Taeyeon give his lunch money to a classmate whose parents had forgotten to pack a meal. He recounted Nalir teaching an elderly neighbor sign language so they could communicate during her weekly visits to the cafe. True wealth, he said, looking directly at his family, isn't measured in what you can buy. It's measured in what you can build, what you can heal, what you can create from love instead of fear. The applause began before he finished speaking, not the polite acknowledgement of a duty fulfilled, but the enthusiastic response of people who'd been moved by something authentic. The Rosemont Foundation's mission has evolved this year, and I want to be transparent about why. We've learned that sustainable change doesn't come from writing checks to feel good about ourselves. It comes from partnering with people who are already doing the work, amplifying voices that have been ignored, and investing in communities that know exactly what they need but lack the resources to implement their solutions. He gestured towards Zarella, who was listening with the focused attention she gave to everything important. Tonight, I'm proud to announce that Zarella Baptiste will be joining the Rosemont Foundation as our Director of Community Wellness, overseeing the expansion of her nutrition programs to 15 cities across the Southeast. The applause was thunderous, with people rising to their feet to acknowledge someone. Many of them had been following through social media and word of mouth for months. Zarella stood gracefully, accepting the recognition with the poise of someone who'd spent years building credibility through action rather than announcement. But more importantly, Drayson continued as the crowd settled back into their seats. I want to thank the people who taught me that leadership isn't about commanding respect. It's about earning trust through daily choices that put other people's needs before your own comfort. His voice caught slightly as emotion threatened to overwhelm the careful control he'd maintained throughout the speech. My sons, Taeyeon and Nalir, have shown me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing the right thing even when you're scared. They've taught me that love isn't something you fall into accidentally. It's something you choose to build deliberately, one conversation and one day at a time. Both boys were beaming now, Taeyeon bouncing slightly in his chair with excitement while Nalir sat perfectly still but radiated pride like a small, well-dressed son. And their mother, the extraordinary woman who built a family and a business and a community from nothing but determination and grace, has shown me what real strength looks like. Not the kind of power that comes from having more money than problems, but the kind of influence that comes from making everyone around you believe they're capable of miracles. Zarella's hand moved to her heart, her eyes bright with unshed tears that made Drayson's chest tighten with love so profound it felt like drowning and flying at the same time. Legacy, he concluded, his voice steady now with absolute certainty, is bedtime stories and homework help and showing up for the ordinary moments that matter more than the occasions that make headlines. It's teaching your children that family isn't just about DNA, it's about the daily choice to love each other through everything that tries to tear you apart. The standing ovation lasted 3 full minutes, but Drayson barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on his family, the 3 people who'd taught him that redemption wasn't about erasing past mistakes, but about becoming someone worthy of the forgiveness you'd been given. As he left the stage, the event coordinator stopped him with a smile. That was beautiful, Mr. Vale. Your family must be very proud. I hope so, he said, watching Taeyeon and Nalir navigate the crowd toward him with the confidence of children who knew exactly where they belonged. I'm certainly proud of them. Zarella reached him first, her eyes bright with emotion and possibility. That was perfect, she said, standing close enough that he could smell her perfume and feel the warmth radiating from her skin. You've come so far from the man who couldn't finish a speech about family values without falling apart. I had good teachers, he replied, pulling her close for a hug that felt like coming home after a long journey. Dad, Taeyeon called, pushing through the crowd with Nalir close behind. Everyone said you did good. Can we get dessert now? Fancy desserts that match our fancy clothes? Absolutely, Drayson laughed, scooping up both boys for hugs that made his expensive tuxedo wrinkle and his heart feel like it might burst from happiness. Whatever kind of fancy desserts you want. As they made their way toward the dessert table, stopping every few steps for congratulations and conversations, Drayson reflected on how much had changed since that first disastrous gala. The same ballroom, the same chandelier light, but everything else transformed by the simple act of choosing love over fear. He thought about the scared young man who'd once thrown away the best thing in his life because he couldn't imagine being worthy of something so precious. He thought about the woman who'd raised 2 extraordinary children while building a business and a community from scratch. He thought about the boys who'd taught him that family wasn't about perfection, but about showing up consistently, especially when it was hard. And he thought about the future they were building together, one ordinary day at a time, proving that the best love stories weren't about dramatic gestures or fairy tale endings. They were about 2 people choosing each other repeatedly, through sleepless nights and homework battles and ordinary Tuesday dinners that felt like celebrations because they were shared with people who made everything better just by being themselves. Later that night, after the gala ended and the boys were asleep in their own beds and Zarella was curled against his side in the home they'd finally decided to share officially, Drayson whispered the truth he'd learned through heartbreak and healing. Some endings are really beginnings in disguise. What's beginning? She murmured sleepily. Everything, he said, kissing the top of her head and listening to the sound of his family breathing peacefully around him. Everything that matters. Sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about revenge or dramatic justice. They're about ordinary people choosing to love each other despite everything that makes it complicated. Sometimes the greatest victory is simply showing up for the people who matter most, day after day, until showing up becomes the foundation for everything beautiful you build together. Have you ever discovered that the ending you thought you wanted wasn't nearly as beautiful as the beginning you never saw coming? If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss more stories about love, redemption, and the courage it takes to choose family over fear. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know what's the most beautiful beginning disguised as an ending in your own life. Your story might inspire someone else to believe in second chances, and that's the kind of legacy that changes the world one heart at a time.